Good morning. It is April the 19th and we are doing our Strategic Planning Council Committee of the Whole meeting this morning. I'd just like to remind everybody that all public meetings are live streamed and recorded. Any verbal or written information provided may be included in public documents as per the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, FOIP 41. I'm going to call this meeting to order at 9 o'clock. We see the agenda before us. Looking to adopt the agenda. Councillor Swanson, those in favor? That is carried. Then we have two sets of minutes under 3.1, Strategic Planning Committee, Council Committee of the Whole from December the 16th. Looking for any errors or omissions. If there are none, looking for somebody to adopt those meeting minutes. Councillor Duncan, those in favor? That is carried. Strategic Planning Council Committee of the Whole from December 17th meeting minutes. Any errors or omissions? Seeing none, looking for somebody to motion for that. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer, those in favor? Thank you. That's carried. That brings us to 4.1, Clearwater County Reserves, past, present, and future. Well, I'm glad we all survived the weekend. It was an Alberta spring weekend for sure. We started with sun and suntan and t-shirts, and then we found our long johns for Sunday. So we'll see what today brings. Look forward to what corporate services is sharing with us today. Who would like to lead? Mr. Hagan.
Thank you, Reeve Laird. Perhaps I'll start off and then I'll turn it over to Mrs. Serhan. So the timing for this meeting is very good, given that we're currently finalizing the financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2020. And one of the critical activities and opportunities for council is to discuss and make some decisions about reserve transfers, not only the current year surplus, but also an opportunity to look and perhaps do some rebalancing if council wants to, in order to ensure alignment with our strategic plan. So what we're looking for today is some healthy discussion on the reserves themselves, some background and information, and then looking towards an agenda item for the next council meeting where council can approve those transfers, and then those transfers will be integral within the financial statements that will be presented also at the same meeting. So perhaps now, with your permission, Reeve Laird, I'll turn it over to Mrs. Serhan to continue.
We're looking forward to it.
Good morning, Council. Rhonda Serhan, Manager of Financial Services. So just going to do a brief overview before we get into the PowerPoint this morning. So we're going to walk through each of the reserves today that this and past councils have previously diligently saved through the past several years. As council members have changed and the reserve balances and strategic plans have also changed over the years, it will be good to spend some time looking at the past, learning the history, while keeping in mind the future of Clearwater County, the priorities for the ratepayers, and some of the projects outlined in the 10-year capital plan. While we won't have time to go through all of the capital projects planned for the next 10 years, we do want to hit on the major projects that are being funded through the reserves. This is to confirm that we're all moving in the same direction and that our planning supports the future of the community that everyone can be proud of. I just want to mention that the website has some great information on reserves and reserve education. So if anyone has time to go there and have a look at them, that would be, there's some great information there. The plan for today is to start with the history and get a big picture of what the area of reserves are, and it's maybe a little into the details there, but I do, this is a document that I started this year, and I want to have this document grow and educate for many years. So as we go through today and see what's there and what needs to be added, it will be a good education piece, not only for the community, but for future council members. Once we have done that, we can get into a bit more of the detail of what is in each of the reserves and what is planned to go into and come out of some of these reserves for the near future, meaning the next few years. It would be great to identify if funding a reserve annually to smooth out the ups and downs makes sense, or if a reserve has accumulated, what would be sufficient for its purpose. Clarification for the purpose of each reserve is essential, not only to ensure plans mirror those purposes, but to inform the public, province, and future decision makers for Clearwater County. I appreciate you taking the time to delve into the numbers with us. So moving on to the PowerPoint, the first page there is just a definition of what the word reserve means. So a reserve is a supply of a commodity not needed for immediate use, but available if required. An example is Canada's major gold, silver, coal, gas, and oil reserves. So the difference, I just wanted to identify that we call them financial statement reserves, but the title of them is restricted and unrestricted surplus. So reserves in the world of business and finance refers to money in hand, money that's available to be used for a wide range of possibilities, including meeting future planned payments, unexpected events, emergencies, opportunities, etc. There are funds that individuals, companies, organizations, central banks, and governments set aside for future use or just in case. So have we been using the wrong term? Probably, quite possibly. Although the term reserves has been used to describe the equity earmarked for certain projects, the correct term to use is restricted and unrestricted surplus. So restricted surplus is internally earmarked equity for future projects to sustain or enhance the quality of life for Clearwater County ratepayers. Why do municipalities internally restrict surplus? There are several reasons, but the largest reason by far is to offset future tax increases for large projects to maintain or build infrastructure. So when municipalities have surpluses, they need to restrict them and identify which projects they are going to go towards. One of the differences between provincial finances and local municipality finances is that provinces are allowed to run a deficit and municipalities are not. So if they don't have restricted surplus earmarked for projects, then they have to incur debt to pay for those projects. And then, of course, unrestricted surplus. And what's the difference between restricted and unrestricted? Just the fact that it's earmarked for a project or not. So while unrestricted surplus is used more like a contingency available to use without a specific project or use in mind, whereas restricted is set aside for a specific project. So we've discussed the why and the what, so let's talk about how we do this. So technically, the formula for what is included in restricted surplus is all of the assets minus all of the liabilities at a certain point in time for the organization. It's also known as equity. So what's the definition of equity? Equity is the remaining value of an owner or organization's interest in a company after all liabilities have been deducted. So the word equity can also be used to refer to personal finances. a good example is a mortgage. So you purchase a home for $400,000, you have a $150,000 mortgage on it, the equity in that home is $250,000. So this slide is a bit more complex. And this is just to show where the numbers come from for the restricted and unrestricted surplus. So on the statement of, financial position at December 31st, 2019, there's a list of assets there. So cash and cash equivalents are included in that number, as are the investments. But also is the accounts receivable outstanding balance, the land held for resale, the inventories, which include gravel, and prepaid expenses. And then we deduct the liabilities, which are the accounts payable and accrued liabilities at December 31st. You have to pick a time, a date and time to calculate this, and normally it's done at the fiscal year end, so this is December 31st, 2019. Deferred revenue, which is revenue that has come into the organization but not earned yet. So some of that is grants. We haven't met the criteria for a grant. It goes into deferred revenue, and that's the greatest amount of what would be in deferred revenue. So you also subtract long-term debt, and I just want to spend a little bit of time here because sometimes I know the discussion is, should we use reserves or should we borrow money? In the end, on the financial statement, it looks the same. So even though you're borrowing money, that is taking equity out of the organization. So your reserves will decrease if you take out long-term debt. It is subtracted from the assets before the unrestricted and restricted surplus is calculated. So even using debt to pay for projects come out of the equity. In our case, we haven't used long-term debt to pay for any tangible capital assets or any physical assets that Clearwater County owns. So the value in the assets totals the amount of the asset, the value of the asset itself. So those aren't included in this calculation because they offset one another. The other liability that's taken out of the restricted and unrestricted surplus is the landfill closure and post-closure costs. So once you take all of the assets and minus all of the liabilities, then you have a total for unrestricted and restricted surplus. And once you add on the tangible capital asset number, value, that is your total surplus for Clearwater County. I just want to stop there for a minute. I kind of buzzed through that kind of quickly. Is there any questions on that?
Councillor Lang?
So where does the tangible capital assets show on this list?
So they are on this list because they offset one another. The value of them is equal to the equity that we have in them. So they offset one another. So they don't have to be included in this calculation. If we owed money on any of our tangible capital assets, then we would have to take that balance that we owe into consideration. But because we haven't borrowed any money to purchase any of our assets, the equity in them equals the value of them.
So do we have a number for that, for the tangible capital assets?
Yes, we do. So at December 31st, 2019, the total value of the tangible capital assets was $340,651,695.
Sorry, could you
Oh, sorry.
repeat that? I apologize. I
No,
just
that's
don't write
okay.
that quickly.
That's okay. $340,651,695.
Thank you.
Yep. And that number fluctuates based on how much construction or how many assets are purchased, and offset by the amount of depreciation that happens in that year.
Other questions or comments? Seeing none?
So, the next slides are identifying each of the reserves themselves. Trace, can I get you to pass those on? I'm gonna have Tracy hand out a summary of each of the reserves, where it was at December 31st, 2019, and the net amount going in and out of each of the reserves, just so you can see an overview as we go through each reserve individually.
Thank you. I have a question. You
Yeah.
said that this is from December 31st, 2019.
Yep.
We're a year later?
Well, this is, the numbers I used in the beginning was just an example, and those are the most solid numbers I have. We haven't completed the 2020 financial statements yet. However, when we go through each of the reserves individually, this one takes into account most of the 2020 transactions. And you'll see that I've used the word projected in 2020 because, again, the financial statements haven't been completed yet. This is what we're projecting. At the next council meeting, those statements will be finalized, and we'll have solid numbers for 2020. So the first account is the work in progress. So how we use this account is if we've budgeted for tax revenue to be used for a specific project, then we and we don't finish that project in the year that it is budgeted, and we want to carry forward that budget into the next year, then we put it in the work in progress reserve. And then at the end of the next year, we take that money out so that we aren't needing to requisition tax for that project again in the second year. It was already requisitioned in the year that it was planned, and we use the remaining funds that are available for those projects. Just to, I don't want to go through each of the things that are identified in this reserve or in this restricted surplus account, but just to give you an idea of the things that are going in and coming out of that specific account. So at the end of 2020, these were the projects that had not yet been completed and will be completed in 2021. The county facilities account. This restricted fund is designed to build resources to gradually have the funds to have strategically placed facilities to provide services efficiently to Clearwater County ratepayers. Current deposits into this fund include $1.5 million annually and any rental income earned from any properties owned by Clearwater County. This fund would be used for significant upgrades, purchases, or new builds of any facility. So the projected balance of this fund will be $7.2 million at the end of 2020. So do you want me to go through each one and then discuss after, or do you want to discuss them as we're going through them?
What is your wishes?
Let's discuss as we go.
Discuss as we go? That's a thumbs up all the way around. Sounds good, thank you.
Okay. So again, this fund is being annually funded at $1.5 million.
Councillor Duncan.
Upgrades be coming out of this, or I guess it's up to us at budget, how that works, or this is not just for the construction of new buildings?
Correct, so the things that have been funded out of here are upgrades to facilities in the past and sometimes purchasing of a facility. So I believe the Public Works shop had some funds withdrawn out of this fund to cover it, and new builds.
And land would also be part of this then too?
Yep.
Any other supplemental questions? Okay.
So the purpose for this reserve, or this surplus, restricted surplus fund is status quo, it's good the way it is, or, yeah.
So do we have a thumbs up on that? We're good? Keep moving on? Keep this the way it is?
What's left to come out of this one for Leslieville? That would be work in progress, I guess, right?
Yeah,
Just the 2 million there that's up in the
yes.
slide before.
Right, so what was used to fund the build in 2020 was a MSI grant, and then the remainder is coming out of the work in progress reserve because it didn't get completed in 2020.
So no more needed to come out of this one for Leslieville then?
No.
And sorry, I forget if we have anything, we don't have anything budgeted for this fund for 2021, do we? Or not much that I can think of.
It doesn't appear that we have anything planned in any of the next 4 years to come out.
Okay, yeah, just looking at your projected on the
Yeah.
reserves, okay, thank you.
Councillor Lang?
Rhonda, this is a little bit off the reserve topic, but it's about the county facilities. How much are the facilities that we own, what would they be valued and where would they be reflected?
Well, they would be, the value of them would be reflected in that tangible capital assets number, and I'm not sure if we have an up-to-date value. Facilities guy, I'm gonna throw you under the bus. Or Murray, yes.
Somewhere between.
Mr. Hagan?
Thank you, Laird. Just looking back at the December 31st, 2019 financial statements, the cost of all our buildings was $19,345,320. And the accumulated amortization or depreciation on those buildings was $3,104,135. So our equity in those buildings is roughly about $16 million.
Thank you.
That may or may not reflect the market value. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Go ahead, Mr. Hanson.
Yes, just for a reminder, I guess, for council, we have to go back to 2017 when council actually set up the $1.5 million reserve transfer after they reviewed the new administration building report. I say that's going all the way back to this council's very early career, but that's when this $1.5 million was set aside annually, plus the additional rental revenue that we get from our other facilities, and that major capital project is scheduled for 2028.
Thanks, Eric.
Questions or comments? Seeing none, go ahead, Ms. Sharan.
The next one is the tax rate stabilization fund. So from 2009 until 2020, this fund has grown from 3.8 million to 12.9. Councils of past and present see the potential collapse of the oil and gas assessment in Clearwater County, which funds approximately 85% of their tax revenue. This fund was to create a buffer, to buffer the future decline in these assessments. deficits in the past several years were projected to come out of this reserve, which with unexpected revenue in the forms of grants, oil and gas well drilling tax, and for the most part, have helped to fund those projected deficits, and withdrawals have remained unnecessary.
Councillor Duncan.
We currently have a cap on this one, 15 million or something?
We don't have any in policy at the moment, and based from these discussions, I really would like to get an up-to-date policy on what we feel the formula should be for calculating the balances of these funds, and if there's a minimum and maximum that should be held in them.
So when John and I started, I remember that at that time, the thought behind this fund was that if there was ever anything that happens, that we had a zero, a huge disaster or something, that we had zero income for a year, that there would be enough in this fund to run the county for a year, or basically keep us going. So it's, and at that time, we did, I think, discuss something like 15 million or something was where we're at, but that probably isn't anywhere near enough anymore for something like that. And I guess the thought behind this fund, it looks like it has sort of changed as well, is sort of buffering this collapse of the oil and gas assessment. But I guess I would go back to, this should probably always remain part of this, the idea behind this fund is if there is, something catastrophic in the county that people are unable to pay taxes and for whatever reason. But maybe it is prudent too to set and we have some caps on these for other ones, and I don't know what the number is for this one, but it may be too many microphones on, I guess. It may be prudent to set a cap for this one as well, I don't know. Typically, we've only taken out $1 million or so a year out of this one just to balance the budget. This is what we've been doing the last couple of years. I do remember discussing, I think there was one fairly severe downturn, it might have been 2013 or something, where I even suggested we use part of that, but we did not ever use any of this fund until this council came along, I believe. I don't know if John has anything to add on that one, but.
Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Yeah, we don't have data from the previous couple of years here, but I don't believe this fund has ever been much higher than it is right now. Is that correct?
Yes, this is the highest it's been, and we haven't ever utilized this fund. We've budgeted to have deficits come out, but we've always had surpluses to cover the projected deficits, whether that be from oil and gas well drilling tax or extra grants that were received, but we haven't had to fund the deficits through this fund before.
So I would conclude that this is sufficient, certainly at this time, and the way it's projected out into the future, it's projected to hold constant. Yes, to comment on Councillor Duncan's recollections about this also being in place in case some truly unexpected disaster happened. It's important to have some money set aside, but I would also expect that in a truly calamitous situation that the services provided by the county would also be reduced somewhat at that time. So I feel pretty comfortable that we have enough money set aside here.
Mr. Hagan.
Thank you, Reeve Laird. And just to lend some additional information, with reference to the annual operating costs for 1 year, that would be not including amortization. That'd be in the neighborhood of $30 to $32 million. So if that was the intention of council, is to have 1 year's operating expenses covered there, this balance would need to go up quite a bit.
Councillor Duncan.
I don't know, I guess I would look to staff a little bit here. I would not ever see a year when we had zero tax revenues. I don't think that is ever gonna happen unless we were gonna forgive everything for a year for whatever reason, but, so I wouldn't see the need to go to 30 million, you know, to 1 year's operating revenue here, but I would suggest it's, right now, we're projected to leave it as it is, and we move things in and out of this. If we use it for budget to, like Rhonda said, we typically put back in either from surplus or from allocation of reserves, we put back in what we take out of this one on a fairly annual basis, so. Right now, it's projected just to say it is. We have no annual allotment to this one, so I think just leaving it where it is right now would probably be fine unless we start to use it for some reason to, and draw it down quite a bit year after year.
I believe the question remains, are we still interested in creating some policy where we define the purpose for the fund and include a minimum and maximum in the fund and how we're going to fund it annually perhaps? Is there value in creating that policy so that, I guess, future council members then have a defined path to take? Thoughts on creating a policy to better define purpose and minimum and maximum? Councillor Swanson?
Looking through like all the reserve titles that we have on, so maybe it's mislabeled in this particular instance, and maybe we just need to find a new title because it just references tax rate, and maybe it's just called a stabilization fund. Just take tax rate out and just, so therefore it's for that rainy day, if we need it for continuing of operation or whatever, going about it that way. So I'm just suggesting we just take out those two words and just call it the stabilization. So for whatever we need.
Councillor Duncan?
I think that's a good idea. I would agree with that.
Deputy Reeve Vandermeer?
I just have one caution on that, and that is that it's important to define these reserves to be restricted. We do not want to get this into the unrestricted category. So if it's too general, if it's a slush fund, that's not appropriate. So, but the better we can define these things, the better it is, I think.
So is there some middle ground if we left it as tax stabilization and just removed the rate? Mr. Hagan, I've seen your lights on.
Sorry, I didn't intend for it to be on, but I did have a thought on that I'll share. Perhaps the financial stabilization or even budget stabilization might just narrow it down a little bit.
What is your preference? Financial stabilization or budget stabilization for renaming? Financial? Councillor Lougheed?
Yeah, I'm not as caught up in a name change. I think the intent or purpose of it is the key thing here. So if we want to change it to financial, I'm fine with that.
Deputy Reeve Vandermeer?
Yes, I'm okay with either budget or financial stabilization.
You don't have a preference?
No.
Okay. Councillor Lang?
I'm fine with either. I don't have a preference, and I think maybe administration, Maria Rhonda might be able to give us a bit of an idea what might be the best wording.
Councillor Hoven?
I don't have a preference for a name.
Councillor Swanson?
No preference either, so whatever administration feels would be the best.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing that come forward with administrative recommendation on the better wording there. Are we still interested in creating a policy with regard to minimum, maximum, and definition for the purpose of the fund? Councillor Lang.
The first thing that kind of popped into my mind when I thought of a policy, and I know Councillor Duncan and Deputy Vandermeer feels we're fine where we're at. But I'm just wondering, we're so close to reaching half of what the operating costs were. I believe Mr. Hagan said the operating costs last year were 30 to 32 million. I'm just wondering if we should have a goal of getting to half of the operating costs. We're about, 13 million now, very close to it. So operating costs over time generally go up. So I'm just kind of wondering if a goal of at the halfway point would make sense.
Very well. Half of the goal, I'm going to start at the other side of the room this time. Councillor Swanson, goal of half of an annual operating cost.
I would assume that over time that annual operating costs will fluctuate on any given year. So if we just have the general term, half of the operating, that means that this particular fund could then fluctuate as well, right? So just for clarification, so if we word it that way, then that's fine. And then as far as a minimum to keep in there at any given, I mean, we could drain it in one year, but I mean, a minimum, I don't know, do we ever have a minimum in any of our reserves? Sorry, well, that's my question.
Surplus accounts.
Yeah.
Well, we don't, I don't think there is in policy any minimums. We would use, for example, the disaster has $2 million in it, and sometimes that one would go to zero, and then we'd have a maximum. Yeah, maybe a minimum isn't required, but a maximum probably is.
Very well. So we don't need to worry about the minimums. We'll just worry about where the cap is. Where's the ceiling? Councillor Hoven, half the operating would be a goal, or do you have a different perspective?
I agree with Councillor Lang. I think half of the operating is a good goal to have, and that's just the moving target out in the future, and you just transfer money in every year, and it's effectively our rainy day fund.
All right. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Yes, I would be comfortable with half of the operating budget as being the top side of this fund.
Councillor Lougheed.
Yeah, I think definitely the intent of this one would be bolstered by having a cap at halfway. I don't see a need to have a minimum amount here because that really hamstrings the intent of this, which is to create flexibility within the budget. And so I don't agree with a lower limit, but an upper limit is a cap.
Councillor Duncan.
I'm okay with the proposed cap as well.
Very well. Mr. Hagan.
Thank you, and again, for clarification, I would suggest that it referred to half the operating expenses, not including amortization, because that's another 20 million. So there's really no need to have a reserve to fund that. It should be just the true cash expenditures, which would be in that $30 million range.
Just a question of process here. Would we be looking at a policy for each fund or just a policy that covers the funds and then maybe an appendix or something that has the caps in them or something like that to just make it more flexible to change? Rather than amend policy to, if a cap was to change or something.
I believe there's several policies, and I'd like to bring them all together into one policy.
Okay.
And, yeah, indicate the purpose and intent for each reserve, and then, like you say, a schedule probably would be great for maximums, or how, at least, how they're calculated.
Right, because some of them would be based on 10-year capital plans or something, like the
Yeah.
fire apparatus or something, so. Okay, thank you.
I believe we've beat that one up pretty well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next one is the Nordegg Development Fund. So this fund was created as a kind of due to or due from account. Anytime there was development of any kind, it was taken from this fund. This usually put Nordegg in a due to the county scenario. Once lots were sold, those funds are credited back into the account to offset the cost of the development in Nordegg. With the exception of using some MSI funds to supplement funds for the sanitary system that went into Nordegg over 10 years ago now, the lot sales have funded most of the development there. So even with the construction of the Nordegg Historic Core in 2020, the balance of that reserve is projected to be due to the county of $3,986,447. And Clearwater County has already had over $1 million in lot sales in 2021. So you can see on the summary document that a couple years ago, if you'd had looked at this document, there was significant withdrawals, and I'll say that in quotations because there's no, it's in a negative balance, in the millions of dollars for 2020 and 2021, and that has changed significantly. Not because the projects aren't moving forward, but because the lot sales are so strong that it's offsetting the expenses that are, or expenditures that are happening for Nordegg development. Again, I think the goal for this one is 0.
Councillor Duncan.
We had discussions a number of years ago about what qualifies for coming out of this fund, and the example here being some of the MSI that went into the sanitary system, because there are, for example, the public works building that was not funded out of the Nordegg fund, right? That comes from
Right.
either facilities or something else. So I
Right.
think, the policy on this one should probably clearly define
Correct.
what is the criteria for whether it comes in or out of this fund, because and maybe it's a partial, I don't know.
Yeah, there's,
Like the downtown core, that's development, right? But then
Right.
is the infrastructure there, the water and the sewer, it's not maybe entirely for Nordegg development either, so.
yeah, this is definitely complex. We've kind of, in the past, had discussions every year, every couple years about what's coming out of there or going, for example, if there's snow plowing, we would snow plow whether there was development there or not. So, we want to make sure that those costs are not coming out of the development, but truly the costs of developing those lots and providing services to that development, the initial services are coming out of there. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that the cost of the lot themselves comes out at the time that the lot is sold. So there are dollars sitting in the land held for resale that would come out of this Nordegg development reserve at the year that lot is sold. So the actual cost of the lot isn't significant because we didn't have to purchase the land. So the bigger cost is the developing the infrastructure, which comes out at the time that it's completed. So
So for example, the mobile home park is all developed now. And
Yes.
those costs, it's been paid for, but
Yes.
they're not recognized yet in our,
Well, some of it
Once the
is
lots-
all the roads and the infrastructure that remains, that will remain with the county once the lot is sold, comes out of here once it's completed, which is the majority of it. I'm gonna say 90%. And then 10% is attributed to developing the lot itself. So there's some surveying costs, maybe some grading and leveling, so the lots can be prepared for sale. I think this one, the mobile home park in particular, had the services right to the lot, like into the lot, not just to
Yes.
the edge, right? So there's a little bit of servicing that is attributed to the lot itself that will go towards the cost of the lot once it's sold. But the majority of the costs, the roads are the main thing, and the infrastructure getting to the development come out of this fund at the time that the work is completed.
so once a lot is sold in Nordig in the mobile home park, does the owner of the lot then assume the responsibility for the sewer line and that's inside his property boundary? So
Correct.
if there's anything damages or fails at some point, then it's
Correct.
their cost after that.
Yes.
Deputy Reeve Vandermeer. Mr. Hagan, did you have a comment?
I was just gonna lend some background for council's benefit to better understand why some things go into an inventory versus some things being charged right through, as Rhonda explained. And it really comes back to the matching principle, which is a key element of accrual accounting. So what we're trying to do is match the costs with the related revenues. So in the case of building the county infrastructure, we've either got some grant funds that are available to pay for that, or it's coming out of tax dollars, or it's coming out of reserve, and we want to match all that. So that work's complete. We've got the revenues we've recognized, and that's why we recognize it at that point in time. With the lot sales, the revenue hasn't happened yet. We haven't sold the lot. So we effectively defer those costs in an inventory account until such time as they're sold. Now we bring them together. And then the net revenue, as Rhonda referred to, ends up improving that reserve balance. That's our profit on that sale. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Supplemental?
So what about tax revenues and ongoing tax revenues there? If the tax revenues from all the lots in Nordig are exceeding the services of those lots, then is there funds then that would go into this reserve to help pay for that infrastructure that was put in? Because that's one of the ways we try and recoup over the long term, right, is tax revenue.
Mr. Hagan?
And I can appreciate the question, Councillor Duncan, and it really gets into a bigger picture at that point when we talk about tax revenue. We don't allocate tax revenue anywhere within the county to a specific community. It goes into what Mrs. Serhan has referred to as the community purse, which is a very appropriate title. And that funds all of the ongoing operating expenses of the county for the benefit of all ratepayers. So I would say no to try and keep track of the Nordig property tax revenues separately would be inconsistent with how we handle those revenues on a county-wide basis. I think there's a general principle that we're hoping that with the development is going to lead to a larger tax base, but that's the same argument that we would hold for any of our hamlet growth and development plans. We hope that it contributes to that community purse on a bigger basis so that we can continue to improve quality of life for residents in the county no matter where they live.
Okay. Mr. Hanson?
I guess just one thing I just wanted to add to, not to try to muck up the conversation too much, but urban developers and urban municipalities typically use offsite levies to help supplement, because that's one thing that I know of this, to build off the discussion that Murray was just discussing there, is that yes, we have the due from accounts for the capital cost of the construction, but there has never been a offsite levy account would actually supplement the additional infrastructure required for the upgrades to your water system, upgrades to your sewer system, which is typically done in your urban settings. So it's another tool in the toolbox that this municipality's never used, but I think it's something that should be aware that it's something that could be utilized maybe in the future as we're seeing additional growth. We have a pretty aggressive 10-year capital plan. Hopefully, if Nordegg were to take off in that type of nature, that could be a tool that this municipality could use to actually help recover some of these additional costs specific to that area, which is the water sewer upgrades, not just the tax revenue increase there to offset these costs.
Thank you for your patience. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Yes, thank you. I just would like to make sure I understand a couple of numbers here. When you look at the projected balance in the Nordegg development at negative 3.986 million at December 31st, 2020, does that include all of the sales that took place, the lot sales that took place during 2020? So all of that information is in that number today?
Yes.
Okay. Then moving over one notch here to indicating that there might be $503,000 of net capital investment by the county in 2021. That does or does not contain the $1 million of lot sales so far in 2021. It doesn't, or does it project any of the lot sales in 2021?
In 2021 budget, there was a budget of $890,000 worth of lot sales, so that is included in there. But we've exceeded that already, and the excess is not included.
Okay, that's helpful. So, given that we have exceeded the budget, do you have any other projections that are more up to date at this point in time? Are we going to get another $500,000, another $1 million, or
I don't
have we
know.
sold all the lots that we can in Nordegg this year?
I don't know.
I
Okay.
think, Deputy Reeve, I appreciate that, but I don't know that their crystal ball's any better than ours. We hope it's great.
I wish I knew.
Okay. Thank you.
Other supplemental questions or comments? So as I look at, obviously we're going to be building some sort of policy document with all of these. I anticipate that the Nordegg development will have a little bit more definition around it, including this matching principle, perhaps, so that it's better defined and understood for future council members and administration, I'm sure, as well. So,
Yes. Thank you.
thank you.
And the goal 0 is good, right? So the next fund is the Municipal Recreation and School. So this is a legislated fund, for the most part, that monies are paid to the municipality in lieu of green and recreation spaces when developers are developing other spaces within the county. So for example, a multi-lot subdivision, there's a certain amount legislated that has to be green space, or they can pay dollars in lieu of that green space. And then the county would be responsible for creating that green space in some other spot within the municipality. So there is legislation surrounding what these funds can be spent on. This is where council placed the matching funds for the new school builds in Leslieville and Condor in 2018. And the balance of this fund at the end of 2020 is projected to be $1,318,187.
Any questions or comments? Councillor Lang.
Is that fund on this sheet?
Oh, it's called recreation facility.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
No, that's different. Yeah.
Yeah, I just would have a comment here. We saw this grow by $45,000 in 2020, and then it's flat. That's a projection indicating that there will be no further developments by developers in Clearwater County in the future.
Yeah, there must be something wrong with my formula there. I'll have a look at it.
Are we annually funding it by a certain amount?
By the amount that is contributed to Clearwater County through the developer levies that are paid in lieu of green and recreation spaces. So it really depends on how much development there is within the county. In 2020, it's projected to be $45,750. So I think the budget typically is around 20,000. So I just have to see why that isn't showing up in my net change there.
Other questions or comments? Councillor Hoven, and then I'll go to Councillor Duncan. Okay, Councillor Duncan?
So just a comment, I guess, and this then is potentially one fund we could use for those, some of the, maybe in the recreation areas, some of the one-off capital projects that exceed our budgets that we have right now in place for recreational funding, or doesn't really, like, community halls wouldn't really qualify, but if it was, you know, a new skating rink somewhere or something like that we wanted to fund, then this, to me, this would be a fund that we could typically, or potentially delve into for that. We've never used it in the past. NSRP could be another place we could, if it was recreational based, perhaps. I don't know, I guess our policy will have to maybe more clearly define that once we can work on that at a future date as well.
I think the last time this fund accessed was the construction of the hub in Caroline, used some of these funds.
Or the Southeast Rec Grounds or something,
Yeah.
yeah.
Councillor Swanson?
So our two new rec boards, the Raven and the North Saskatchewan Rec Board, they don't come out of this, they come out of the community?
No, right, they come out of community funding. I'll have to look up the legislation, but I don't think that operating of green spaces is qualifies. It would be developing green spaces.
Okay. And you've used a different wording on the PowerPoint than it's listed here, and you call it Municipal Recreation and School.
Yeah,
I
it
actually
should
like,
be.
I like that name, actually,
Yeah.
so. if we
I
could-
think that comes out of the legislation. I think those are the three, that's kind of what the legislation says can be spent on is school recreation
Okay,
and
thank you.
municipal green spaces, so I'll make sure I update this sheet. So the next one is, on the sheet is called NSRP. I added intersection construction to be more clear because that is what was intended for the dollars when they were identified into this fund. When Alberta Transportation started talking about the necessity of upgrading the intersection of Highway 11A going into the NSRP, the county committed to the first $500,000 and subsequently agreed to fund 50% of the rest of the cost. This fund is projected to sit at $900,000 at the end of 2020.
Mr. Hanson?
So just to maybe update the verbiage on that slide there, so as of during budget discussions there, when we set up the budget for construction of the intersection this year, we'd discussed, it was very late in December, a very positive conversation with Alberta Transportation and the town of Rocky Mountain House, that we've agreed to a 1/3 share on the intersection improvement there, right at for the River Road NSRP intersection construction. And so the design currently is complete, and we're just going through some landowner notification consultation right now, and we're working through that. So we're very hopeful that we'll be ready for construction this summer.
So just for clarity, the county would be on the hook for 1/3. Who are the other 1/3 and 1/3?
So Alberta Transportation's agreed to fund approximately 300,000, the town 300,000, and then the county for 300. So that's, I was based on a former estimate. So once we go out to tender, we'll be able to get real dollars and real amounts for the cost share. And they both, it's been caveated that it's gonna be actual costs, not just estimated costs.
Thank you for the clarification. That's great news. This has been a long time coming. Councillor Duncan.
How far does that treatment go? Does it go, is it all the road right through the existing land there, or is it just on the highway itself, or is it gonna go right back to where it joins the road going into North Saskatchewan River Park?
So currently the design includes the intersection itself, so basically a bypass lane as well as a designated right-hand turn lane in. We're hoping to connect onto Cliffside Trail, which is directly west of West End Husky, as well as correct that curve off the corner of the town lot to hook back into the River Road. So it's a slight improvement right from River Road through that the town-owned lot with the old house, and then upgrade Cliffside Trail, and then the intersection itself.
Okay, good, thank you.
Other questions or comments with regard to this project and this surplus fund? Seeing none?
Next is broadband fund has grown consistently over the last 2 years, topping out at 12.4 million, while using just over 1 million of those funds in 2020. It is projected to spend the balance out of this reserve in 2021.
Any questions or comments? Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Well, the obvious question is that this fund needs to be enhanced as we go forward, so provision has not been made for that in the overall plan. So we'll have to take a look at what the plan looks like, and we will have a workshop on this topic, I know, coming up later in May, so that'll be the time to look at this in more detail, I suppose.
Seems like the appropriate time to have that further discussion on future funding for this particular restricted surplus. I'm gonna keep working on that term.
Me too, as you can see in my slides.
And then I see a beautiful picture of somebody else's airport, which is
Yeah.
okay. Maybe that's what we'll look like someday.
Maybe. So Clearwater County has been aware of the need for a new terminal building at the airport for some time. Some funds were set aside, but not being sure where this project was on the town's priority list, it had not been a priority. Recently, this has become a priority for both municipalities with hopes of moving forward in the next year or two. At the end of 2020, this fund is projected to be at 980,000.
Is there any requirement, and I guess that's a conversation we need to have with our partners with the town, with regard to maintaining a capital for, upgrades to the taxiway and the runway and any other lighting systems and or radio systems. And I think those conversations, the Airport Commission needs to have a conversation about what does that 10-year capital look like, so that we're not suddenly surprised by potential paving or runway builds. That sort of funding, I think, needs to be described, and I think it needs to be identified with the commission. Other thoughts or comments?
Maybe I'll just give a bit of history. Clearwater County has been contributing to capital reserve for those minor capital projects. And I want to say minor because I don't know that we could pave a taxiway at $15,000 a year, but we've been contributing into a reserve or a restricted surplus fund with the town. We forward those funds to the town every year at $15,000 annually.
Just to clarify, so we've been forwarding $15,000 for a reserve fund for taxiway and runway maintenance?
No,
or-
I want to say minor capital upgrades. Like I said, I don't think it would be accumulate fast enough to resurface the taxiway or anything like that. But I know they bought a secondhand snow plow a few years ago, or is that right? And that was funded out of that fund. Maybe some lighting, it's just.
Mr. Magnus?
Rhonda's correct in that that reserve has been established, that we've contributed to the town, and for such items as the plow truck a few years ago, along with lighting and the navigation system, upgrades to the navigation system and so on. And the funds we set aside for 2021 include not only the terminal building, but we, in our funds for the upcoming 2021, also included work on the navigation system and some electrical work as well.
Thank you for that clarity. Mr. Hagan?
Thank you, Reeve. Additional point of clarification, just from a presentation perspective, you won't find that number in our reserves or our restricted surplus because the town is holding it. You'll see that in our accounts receivable. So we've essentially turned that money over to the town further to the agreement. They're holding it for us, and if they were not to use it, we'd have a claim to get that money back. That's why it's shown as an account receivable. One quick question for Mrs. Serhan. Do we happen to know what the balance of that fund is right now?
I don't have a number right now.
Okay, sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay.
I was going to ask that question, so I can appreciate it. Councillor Lang?
Yeah, just for clarity, so if any of these dollars go towards capital or snow truck or something like that, the town matches it 50%?
Correct, we are on title for 50%.
Okay, and so any that's left over at the end of the year, we have to apply to get it back? Did I understand you?
No, we just leave it with them to accumulate for the next item that they want to purchase. So I don't know what their capital planning looks like because they're the managing partner, but.
And do they automatically provide an accounting to the county?
Yes, every year during audit.
Thank you.
Well, I anticipate that there is an opportunity for the Airport Commission to have further discussion on a projected capital plan, perhaps a 5 or 10-year capital plan, so that we can figure out if the funding strategies match what the projected projects are.
Yes.
And we can go on a system forward from there. So I will be sure to add it as an agenda item for the upcoming June Airport Commission meeting.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments with regard to the airport? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next.
There's 3 funds identified in this slide. They're fire related. The 3 are facilities, 4, facilities, training, apparatus, and HQ. The facilities are funded $300,000 annually. The fire training funds is a new fund that paid on-call fire staff when being deployed for wildfire seasons. These were the funds that were invoiced to those municipalities that our paid on-call went to work for. And these funds have been earmarked for a training facility that is planned for 2021 construction. This fund will be spent and be at zero at the end of 2021. Unless, of course, they get deployed, I guess, and have more revenue. The apparatus fund is the one that supports the purchase of the equipment for Clearwater County's portion of the regional service. This fund is being built with $700,000 allocations annually. Christina spent many hours configuring a plan for purchase of this apparatus that allows for the purchase within these allocations. At the end of 2020, the balance of this fund would be $2,290,089. And the fourth one is the HQ reserve, which began when headquarters equipment was not being purchased every year. It was when there was maybe 2 pieces of equipment or vehicles being purchased in subsequent years, and then maybe 2 years where there was none. So to even them out, there was a tax requisition being collected every year instead of hiking the requisition in the year of purchase. So these purchases are now being made annually, and probably the purpose for this reserve no longer exists.
So when we have subsets like this, how do we identify it in the spreadsheet, if
Yeah,
at all?
they're all separate. So I think there's 3 right together: fire facilities, fire training, and fire apparatus. And then disaster is in between that, and then fire HQ. So they're all identified separately. We did have them together at one point, but because there was dollars going in at different rates for different amounts and for different purposes, and then also different amounts coming out for different purposes, we split them just so that we could track the dollars that were earmarked for facilities versus the dollars for the apparatus. And then, of course, that training fund was specific dollars earmarked for that training facility, so.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Councillor Duncan?
I think recommendation here is at some point we just terminate this fund, or the HQ
The
fund, right?
HQ fund, unless Christine has other,
I'm just trying, because you still show some activity in it over the next few years, but.
yeah, we would probably take that and just fund it through. Because I think what's happening is there's dollars going in and dollars going out close to the same rate every year.
Ms. Hager?
So I just, yeah, go ahead, Christine, and
Perfect, thank you, Reeve Laird and Council. In terms of that reserve, because of the nature of the new intermunicipal fire rescue services agreement, we don't believe that reserve will be required in the future. So any of those HQ, what the formerly called HQ purchases of command vehicles, those would be, that dollars would be expended, and once it's expended, the reserve would no longer exist. Just since we have the reserves available, we'll use those before we'll requisition our municipal partners for the service, if that makes sense. And then future forward, the new agreement reflects that any capital purchases are part of that annual budgeting process that are approved by the ICC committee. And each of the municipalities determined that they would hold their own reserves to fund capital if that was their choice. So instead of us holding it on their behalf, they've said just requisition us and we will take care of figuring out how we're going to fund that. So that actually makes it more simple for us. So that reserve will disappear. And I think that answers the question.
Thanks, Christine.
No problem.
I believe so. Very well. That then takes us to the next item.
So the next slide is called disaster, but I think it should be renamed to emergency preparedness or something like that. Christine maybe has a better idea what.
Ms. Haggart?
Absolutely. Totally up to council's discretion. Disaster is a terminology that's still used in the emergency management world. We could certainly keep that if council wishes. The other term that I would suggest it could be changed to would be emergency management or emergency management business continuity, that sort of thing. This is just the preliminary dollars we're setting aside. And council's always had that threshold of $2 million for that. So it's like dollars that are immediately available at our fingertips until we know where the province sits in terms of emergency and whether there'll be any provincial or federal grant dollars coming for the emergency itself. If council's looking for a place to change procedure in terms of how we fund the reserve, this one might be one to consider, because with the new disaster relief program changes, there's less money that may be available for private folks and for municipalities in terms of disasters and how they're funding things one time and not consistently year over year. So certainly that's something council can consider boosting, because the cost of disasters has significantly increased. I know that the committee took a look at the province's review at their last emergency management committee meeting, and that was one of the themes from that report, was that the cost of emergencies are increasing. So certainly somewhere we could, I think we're okay for now, but we could certainly look in future to continue to fund that to a higher amount perhaps.
Okay. And I think that emergency preparedness, it has a more positive spin on it for sure. And it probably is more encompassing for sure than disaster. Because there are dollars that you do spend to mitigate and prevent these events. The other part of this that I completely agree that we need to think of some sort of annual funding mechanism. Since the provincial government's recent announcement of a 90-10 split on funding, then it becomes the disaster. We, as a municipality, then have an obligation for 10% of any of these large events. And these large events can run up the tally quite quickly. So I think as part of our future discussions about this, it's most definitely prudent to consider what an annual funding amount would be, and perhaps figuring out a cap for this as well. So just food for thought from my perspective. Other thoughts or comments? Deputy Reeve Vandermeer?
Just one thought, the back up to the tax rate stabilization and the money set aside there. This is somewhat complementary to, a disaster, a unexpected calamity. Is this 2 million actually a part of, as an example, if we have 13 million there and 2 million here, we have 15 million to cover very exceptional circumstances. May we consider it properly funded at this point in time, approaching the 50% of our operating budget? Just a question, thought.
Councillor Duncan?
I think there's probably some more capital items here than it would be operating in this one. It's gonna be roads that are washed out and gone, or buildings gone or something like that. I guess we need to maybe get a bit better handle on how much we've spent over the last 10 years and how much we've recovered versus what we can expect to recover and spend in the next 10. We're seeing quite a change. Like I said, even 10% can add up to quite a bit. But we're also seeing changes in the way we do things. There's fire smart programs. There's, we're not allowing those builds in 100-year floodplains, that kind of thing as well. So we're also trying to mitigate some of that risk as well, not just anticipate more of it.
Deputy Reeve Vandermeer?
Yeah, I guess, Councillor Duncan mentioned, what's happened in the past. We have had a couple of flood incidents, which are about the closest thing we have gotten to a disaster in our area. 2005, 2013, did those, as an example, did those costs exceed $20 million? Because if we were responsible for 10% of one of those events, I doubt that we incurred costs exceeding 20 million in that, but I don't know. Maybe you have comments from Public Works or other.
As I recall, and I'm happy to be corrected, I think we had 80% of our bridge structures affected in 2005. Perhaps Public Works can help us with that.
I'm afraid we've lost the best resource for that information. He just walked out on Friday. He would have had all those numbers for us there. There again, talk about loss of skill and loss of information is before my time, is before Kurt's time now. But if it's information that we need to dig up and bring back for you, we certainly can.
Well, those are the numbers I recall, but I wouldn't want to be staking my life on it. But I do agree. There's a bit of a loss of that little bit of history there, a lot of history. Councillor Lougheed.
Just my comment around this particular surplus is that it's meant really for an immediate contingency, if you would, for that initial response to an emergency, not necessarily for the long-term reconstruction of those facilities might be lost. So I think it gives some flexibility to our administration to be able to respond to those emergencies without necessarily finding some room in the budget for it.
Councillor Swanson.
And not to add anything more, but I would suggest that, yes, it's been flooding in the past and maybe it's a fire in the future. And it would be interesting to note, some of the other areas within Alberta that have had fires in the last few years, what has been some of the typical expenses, and, what would 10% of that look like as well. So I'm not sure what with the dryness, I read yesterday that there was 33 wildfires just alone this past weekend. So knowing that unless we get a substantial amount of moisture, that could very well be possibly what we'd be looking at this year. So anyways.
All right. Is there more information or dialogue that council can help provide with regard to this particular surplus account? All right, I do see that the next one goes into Public Works. We've been in the seats for just about an hour and a half already. Perhaps there's a golden opportunity right now for a 10 or 15-minute break. Let everybody top up their coffee cups, stretch your legs. So we'll be back at, what is it? 10:40. Okay, we're just returning from a break. I believe we have concluded emergency preparedness, formerly known as disaster. We're moving on to Public Works. Ms. Sherhan.
So this one was a little bit curious was as I was going through the information. So this fund was renamed from Public Works Capital to Public Works Vehicles and Equipment. Went back to 2015 and it was Public Works Capital then. And there were funds added in that year in anticipating of expanding the then current Public Works shop or having funds to either construct or purchase a new administration building. Subsequently, the salt and sand facility in Caroline used funds from this restricted surplus allocation, and additional allocations have been accumulating at $150,000 annually. The allocations have been used to purchase the larger public works equipment that are needed from time to time, like the loader or the grader. The anticipated balance at the end of 2020 is $5,762,995. And the addition that was put in 2015 was right around 4 million. So I don't know if that needs to be discussed, and I don't know where Kurt would like to see the balance of this reserve.
Okay,
Thank you.
certainly it sounds like the name could use some adjustment.
Well, if we are
Or-
going to use it as a public works vehicles and equipment fund, then perhaps that one allocation should have been put into something else.
Either or, better definition of purpose, for sure,
Yes.
to clarify. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
I think Ms. Sirhan has commented here, this fund looks excessive by any measure. So perhaps some of that could be reallocated.
Thoughts, comments? I think if we better understood the purpose of this fund, that might help. Any thoughts or comments from Public Works, perhaps? I mean, Mr. Magnus?
So again, as Ron had pointed out, historically, money was being put into this fund for and to offset some of those larger equipment purchases. And typically that was for our grader and or packers. Also, in the near future here, we're going to be seeing the purchasing of a dozer out at the landfill. So it is definitely nice to have something there as we continue to move forward with following our fleet and equipment maintenance and management plan in terms of how we go about replacing our equipment. We're going through the cycle of replacing our plow trucks. I think we have a couple left to go there. And those, again, can sit anywhere from 250 to 330,000 for a plow truck. So I don't know exactly how much Deputy Vandermeer would like to potentially reallocate, but just to keep this in mind that we do have ongoing replacement costs and some big ticket items that are upcoming here in the near future, 2023, 2024, 2025, particularly those 3 years.
And thank you for clarifying. For my perspective, and I'm gonna go to my fellow councillors, but from my perspective, I look at the vehicle and equipment and recognize that you probably have some spreadsheet somewhere that has all of the equipment listed on a 10-year capital replacement plan, or maybe they're longer than that. And then you would figure out from there, how to make that sustainable over those years, and that would be how much we would plug in annually to this. I think that for me, before I would be interested in reducing this or changing it. I think I would have a bigger or a better comfort if I knew what that looked like on that capital replacement plan. I wouldn't want to change this until I saw that. At least that's for me, Mr. Magnus.
You're absolutely correct. That is something I do with both Mary and Rhonda on a yearly basis, as we do have a 10-year. My fleet equipment supervisor, Scott Bertel, and I sit down and we regularly plan out our next 10 years. And I can confidently say that if nothing else was put into this fund, that would be depleted within the next 10 years. So I would prefer to continue to contribute to this to offset some of these capital purchases, thereby having to not rely on taxes to fund these purchases.
So that effectively is similar to what is happening in I believe, the fire services and other departments. Councillor Lang, and then I'm going to Councillor Hoban. Okay, Councillor Hoban.
I just want to say I'm comfortable leaving this number as it is. It will be spent. It's not sitting there forever. It's just a matter of when those funds will be allocated. So I'm comfortable leaving it as is.
Councillor Lang.
I do have a question, Mr. Magnus. In past years, what has been the balance? Do you know? I see going forward, 21, 22, it looks like it'll be increasing. Do you know what it was in 18, 17, 16?
I think the lowest it was 5 million.
5 million?
Yeah, there was a large allocation in 2015 of around $4 million. And then it hasn't dropped below 5 since then, I don't think.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Duncan.
My light was on too, but I'm okay with the funds here. I think just our policy needs to clarify what this is for, and I suggested, I think as you suggested, it's the 10-year capital plan for those big ticket items. The buildings themselves should be a separate fund, the capital fund.
That was kind of my thinking on this and clarifying and defining. And once I think we could see how this works in with the 10-year capital fund for our replacement strategy for the vehicles and equipment, I think then we would we'd be better positioned to make a decision about this number. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Yeah, certainly, I do agree that we should see this 10-year capital equipment replacement schedule. I do believe that this, and we have we're adding 150 a year to this. Given that, or a somewhat higher yearly contribution would enable us to reduce the initial amount here, this $6 million range. I continue to think that's it's very much on the high side, but I'll wait and see that replacement schedule.
Other comments or questions? All right. Public Works Capital.
So this fund was created in 2019 with additions for the funding of access roads of 200,000 and the carry forward of the 2019 industrial commercial land development project that hasn't moved forward yet. There are plans to add an additional 1 million to fund the industrial commercial land development in 21, 22, and 23. This would bring this fund to 3.8 million by the end of 2023.
Any comments or Mr. Hanson?
Just briefly, as council may be aware, a recently approved access road that's actually being funded from this restricted surplus. We just had the pre-tender meeting yesterday. That tender will be closing within the next week or so. So we haven't seen too many access road applications come through. This is one of the first ones I've seen, I think, in the last 5 years. So as council may recall, that was funding for that project was to come out of this Public Works Capital Reserve.
Thank you for that clarification. I guess I'm looking further down in the various other placements, because we've got the capital, then we have capital paving, capital gravel, capital, Public Works paving, Public Works gravel, Public Works gravel reclamation. Would this not fit in one of the other three? Obviously not in the paving, so I guess one of the other two. What makes it special?
I'll maybe defer that question back to Rhonda there. We're really looking at, if there's some more efficiencies that can be found. This was, I guess, one step was to actually, we had our access roads, for example, were budgeted for annually. So we combined that amount back in with this Public Works capital. This one's kind of an open-ended, it's a large industrial commercial component to this one, which is more of a economic development strategy compared to the paving, gravel, of course, and gravel reclamation. So perhaps maybe appropriately more an economic development capital savings or something like that, but I'm not great with labels, so I'll maybe turn that back to Rhonda there. Maybe what would be more appropriate.
There's a potential for changing the name is what I hear, and that might better define what this fund is doing or earmarked for, as we've indicated earlier. Ms. Sherhan, do you have any suggestions?
I think the purpose of putting the 200,000 was so that we weren't having that money in budget every year and then not spending it. So that could easily go in the work in progress reserve and pulled out in the year that it's used, and then we could clearly identify that the funds for this is for industrial, commercial land development. I think it's good to be specific about what the projects are. It helps clear the path for future decision-making.
I know in the description you have industrial commercial land development projects.
Yeah. Yes, we will.
Perhaps there's an opportunity playing on those words.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you.
So the next two I've put in the same slide, Public Works gravel and gravel reclamation. They are two funds for distinctly different purposes. The gravel fund is money set aside to purchase land with the ability to excavate gravel from it, and the gravel reclamation fund is resources set aside to do the reclamation on the pits that we are responsible to reclaim, the ones that we've already excavated gravel from. The gravel fund is not being continuously funded and sits at $4.4 million. The gravel reclamation fund is being funded through the use of the gravel reserves. And by reserves, I mean the inventory, and decreases are made at the same amount of reclamation being expensed in that certain particular fiscal year. So currently this fund sits at $5,667,762. It's been quite some time since we had anyone do an analysis of outstanding reclamation for Clearwater County, and this likely should be done in the near future to ensure we are setting aside enough funds for this.
Councillor Swanson.
Kirk, can you remind me when the last time we talked about the gravel levy when that was, and is that still in the air, or did we park that topic?
Mr. Magnus?
Yep, so the community aggregate levy, as put forward by the province as a subset of the Municipal Government Act, we, of course, presented to council. There were some questions here not too long ago, and the council provided input in regards to that survey. So we submitted that survey, and that, I believe, the expiration on that current document is in 2022, December 31st, 2022. So until such time that they've gathered the data and the responses to the survey, they'll come out probably through the RMA as to what the responses were and put forward to the various municipalities as to moving forward with what the next document should stipulate. Again, as a reminder to this council, that there was no intent on our part to establish a levy within this community.
Other questions or comments with regard to Public Works gravel and gravel reclamation? Seeing none. Oh, go ahead, Councillor Duncan, and then I'll go to Councillor Light.
Do we currently have a 10-year plan for gravel pit reclamation, or is it, that would give us some more numbers on those withdrawals that will be needed for that?
Yes, we do. Currently looking at potentially 3 in the next year that would need to be reclaimed. So we do. We have an ongoing 10-year plan. Again, through our Groundland Resources Management Plan, the intent is to continue to maintain that 100-year reserve, right? And so that plan would also account for those pits moving forward in the next year and continues that would be depleted and have to move towards reclamation. So in answer to your question again, yes, we do have a pretty good idea as to where we're going to be year to year.
Sorry, I guess. Ron, I think you explained it, but I'm not quite sure I understand where the funds come from for the gravel reclamation reserve. Are we just putting them in out of tax revenue as needed, or is it a?
No, we identify the cost of the gravel to excavate, crush, get it ready for the road project or whatever project it's being used on. And then there's a small amount added to that to estimate reclamation, so that it gets charged out to the job. And then at the end of the year, we do a reconciliation to what gravel is left in our pits and the value of that gravel, and the value difference between what we've costed out and what's actually left is what goes into that reclamation reserve, so that we bring the value back up to the pits and identify those funds that have already been charged to the job, so that the job actually reflects the reclamation costs as well as the excavation and crushing.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I would just then look toward if that's the right number,
Right.
you know, if that's the right number in the future, and it's based on a 10-year plan perhaps for reclamation and.
Yeah, I don't know, I should have maybe spoke to Kurt, but I don't know when the last time we've had anyone in to do an overall analysis is what I'm thinking, you know, like look at all of our pits and say, you know, your overall liability in gravel reclamation is this.
Supplemental question? No? Okay. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, that takes us to resource roads.
Yes, resource roads. This sits at $5 million in the hopes that Clearwater can cost share with industry and or other levels of government for roads mainly used by industry. I think there's at least one kind of clearly identified that we would like to partner to improve.
Thoughts or comments? Sorry, Mr. Hanson.
No, I think I've discussed this project numerous times. I guess one thing I'd remind, we jumped over the paving. Were we good with that one, or were we gonna discuss the paving?
Paving one's next.
Okay, very good. So resource roads, gonna bring council right back to budget discussions again. The capital plan, we've identified our number one priority as being the Ochese Road. Certainly open to that conversation when the time comes, when the province or the federal government comes as a partnership. This council's indicated clearly that they've been a willing partner to participate in a cost share for the upgrade and paving of that road.
To that end, I, about a month and a half ago, had a conversation with MLA Nixon with regard to the Ochese Road and our desire to have that cost shared project of a third. And at that point, he did seem receptive to that. So we're still waiting for that process to move forward. So there's certainly more conversations to be had, but I'd say, you know, the cost share is certainly still alive and well in at least the conversation stage. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer?
You covered some of the ground on that. Yes, I also have had conversations with parties that are very interested in seeing this road upgraded. And I think that it will happen. Some decision on that could hopefully happen this year. So I think the money will be spent in the next couple of years.
Ever optimistic. Is there anything additional on resource roads? If not, we'll move on to paved roads.
At the end of 2020, it is projected that this reserve will sit at $14,295,000. There are projects in the following years where either new pavement or asphalt overlay projects are being funded through this fund. 2021, 3.6 million. 2023, 3 projects at just over 6 million. 2024 of 3.3 million. Leaving this restricted surplus account at $1,222,000 at the end of 2024, with no additional surpluses being identified for this account.
At $1 million a kilometer, we need to think about what the future looks like. Mr. Hanson.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, as you can see, you know, we've been sitting actually on a fairly large balance in this reserve, or I'm sorry, restricted surplus for a very long time. A lot of that was attributed to a very aggressive asphalt overlay program that was done in 2009 through 12. We sometimes doubled our asphalt overlay programs to get our weight carrying capacities up on our surface roads. But that did create a bubble, and we're just on the cusp of having, you know, coming to the end of that 15-year life expectancy of a surface road in order to maintain its integrity. The deterioration curve after 15 years on a surface road greatly decreases, so it's important to with good maintenance and an overlay program to keep maintaining and investing in that infrastructure to make sure that it lasts for a very long time. But the reality is, as you can see, $14 million doesn't go very far. This council actually set aside additional funds, I believe, back in 2017. Paving was one of the priorities. We've identified, there was, of course, the Timey Road that has been recently completed as of last year. The Spate Road is scheduled to be completed, and then at budget, we discussed with the new intersectional treatment there on Highway 11A and the River Road, as that the River Road's always been looming as a high priority, but until the intersection problem could be solved, it couldn't have been completed till then, or it didn't make any sense. So with that intersection hopefully on its way this summer, that one becomes another priority. So keep in mind that the paved road restricted surplus is for base paved projects, which are new, as well as the asphalt overlay. But you can see quickly it gets depleted over by 2024, and we've never really identified a cap or a maximum or even a threshold, which we'd like to keep that funding at. So I guess when we're going into the policy discussion to see, something that we should be discussing more, as well as if, surplus discussions, when you're looking to add additional funds to another reserve, this may be an option.
All right, so I anticipate, again, just thinking back about capital, we have, and capital budgeting, we've seen what the projects are moving forward, but what we haven't done in my mind, or at least as near as I can remember, is put any kind of annual allocation into this for maintaining those surface roads is what I'm hearing you advocate for. Councillor Lang, and then I'm going to Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, Eric, I just want a little clarification. You mentioned the paved roads come to the end of their life cycle at about year 15. So to redo those roads, does it come out of this reserve?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Well, there's a combination. We try to use MSI funding if available, or if council determines if there's not another competing project for MSI, we try to use MSI. Gas tax is also another funding stream that we can use, but there are competing other capital projects for those funds. And but yes, the paving asphalt overlay is, I think, predominantly funded from that reserve moving forward.
I'm thinking what may help me, perhaps as council, if we had a list of the roads, the paved roads, and when their end of life expectancy is, so that we can, I guess, sort of do some future planning on when we need to be updating or redoing these roads.
Yeah, so the roads are listed in the 10-year capital plan in the current budget, but I think there could be some time specifically set aside to really flesh that out and get everybody a better understanding of the dollars and cents. It's a very large scale to say, and taking into account to the MSI, how long we have MSI for, how long can we project gas tax for, to provide some projections. And I guess the only variable really is the base pave. If a new road becomes a priority, a little bit of a glitch into the whole system because new paved roads are expensive.
Councillor Duncan.
I think Eric answered my thoughts and questions here. These, the numbers there are not, would be assuming that all the money comes out of this fund. I guess as a surplus fund, I would look to it more to cover off the overlays, and that we should probably look for, if we're gonna do other additional paving, we should look for other sources of funding for that. But I would suggest we kind of focus this fund on the overlays, and it would allow us to be much, as Councillor Lang has suggested, once we know the numbers for over the next 10 or 15 years, we can accurately contribute to this fund and set it aside. And then if we want to do additional paving, or another council wants to do additional paving, we would have to realize that those funds have to be reallocated from something else or a new source found.
Councillor Lougheed.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I agree with Councillor Duncan that this fund here, I guess not all our roads have that best before date of 15 years, so we might have the flexibility in this account to be able to move that resurfacing up a year or two, or delay it a year or two, or to shift the project as those roads condition warrants an overlay.
Certainly, we need some flexibility there, and just for clarity, as I recall, the Leslieville Withrow East-West Road, that was grant funded for 2021, and then to be paved in 2022, if I last recall.
That's partly correct. The grant funding was for the grading for 2021. We never brought forward the paving schedule. It had been previously accounted for in 2023. And last time we discussed with council that it was to remain in 2023.
2023, thank you. So we do have a schedule of sorts. Perhaps it's more an opportunity, as you said, in a workshop to really allow us to have those better understandings as we work through that. So I appreciate that. Other questions or comments with regard to paved roads? Mr. Hagan.
Thank you, Eve. On following up on your last suggestion, I'm thinking we have a strategic planning meeting in September, and I would suggest that we consider going through the 10-year capital plan at that time prior to budget. And that will give council and administration an excellent opportunity to flesh these projects out.
All right. It appears appropriate to me, other than I recognize that with the election, you may be redoing some of that work. That's to be anticipated. Ms. Sherhan.
Yeah, I think there's one in June as well, so, and then the one in September, we like to bring most of the capital projects forward, so that takes up a large chunk of the September strategic planning, but for sure this would be great for one of those meetings. Okay. West Country Road. So this is to support industry in the West Country, and additional surpluses are identified here at $300,000 annually.
Mr. Hanson.
Yes, well, this actually is one of those budget items that is separately identified in our servicing and other major projects policy. It's like the last sentence in that policy that outlines is $300,000 annually. I guess one thing I just wanted to maybe just kind of sit on the soapbox here a little bit, that now that the province has started collecting a levy, or will be commencing a levy in the West Country, we can't forget that a lot of the roads that access the West Country are also county roads. $300,000 doesn't go a long ways to upgrade and maintain or upgrade our West Country road inventory. So I guess as we're looking to the province there, when they're trying to find a place to use all the money that they're creating off their levies, yes, we understand that there's a provincial cost as well, but it certainly can't be forgotten that there's a significant investment on our infrastructure, between our roads, our bridges, et cetera. Weed management, there's a series of expenses that come with the county's West Country management as well. So like I said, the $300,000, we saved that money. We've just upgraded another 5 kilometers of the North Fork Road, which, so that gives us 10 kilometers of that road, of that gravel road, which has been upgraded. The next 5 kilometers down to the bridge would be a huge benefit. There's quite a few issues there, but we are seeing some additional wear and tear from the additional recreation use and industry use on our West Country roads. And they're again going to advocate for, if there's a place for an opportunity for additional funding, this may be one that for us to invest additional funds into our West Country roads, but caveat that with, we know the province is collecting money from the users in that area, that some of that contribution should come, I believe, from there as well.
Well, there may be opportunity for those discussion in the coming months as we come to understand what they're anticipated to use it for. I imagine they already have a few of their own ideas as well. So. Other thoughts or comments? Councillor Duncan?
Some of the roads, I'm thinking of, maybe the one in the Blackstone, have we dipped into this fund for, like washouts, flooding issues and that as well for these roads, or is they funded out of other places?
I don't believe we've ever used it for that type of capital construction, as in like more of a maintenance, or does that, we've never used it for any of the flooding events. It's only typically associated with just capital upgrade construction. Resource Roads was a active funding agent that we used to use for a lot of our Chungo Road, as some people may recall. That's when we actually used to get the Resource Road grant, and so we would match that funds. In recent years, the only thing that we've used the West Country Road funding was for upgrading the gravel portion of the North Fork Road, and that's been since 2015. Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Next one is the ASB fund. This could be renamed as well, possibly. Annual additions to this account were being placed here, with the last addition being 2018 of $340,000 to bring this account to $4 million. There's been many discussions of the years, in the last years, of contributing to an ag rec facility. Funds were used from this account in 2020 for the purchase of rec lands in Caroline, and this fund currently sits at $3,717,000 with a placeholder of spending this in 2024. That probably can, I don't know, add if you have questions.
Well, I can tell you, I have had a number of inquiries about this particular fund, and I know I've passed it along to administration. I know I'm not the only one who is on council had inquiries onto this fund. Is there anything that we could perhaps revisit or refresh ourselves on? Mr. Martinson?
Morning, Council. Matt Martinson, Director of Agriculture and Community Services. So Council may recall back in 2020, we had some presentations from some partners and other folks, stakeholders in this area. And at that time, Council had directed administration to further study this issue, specifically to take our feasibility study and do some business planning and infrastructure costs associated with the amenities and programming that was identified in the feasibility study. So we started doing that last year. We got, obviously, like a lot of projects, we got a little bit challenged by COVID. The entire recreation world put on hold for a while, and certainly trying to hire consultants in an area where we haven't done a lot of this type of work in the past, challenged us. So, without giving council a whole bunch of excuses why we didn't get it done last year, that was a challenge for us. This year, we're able to get going with our consultants, but the recreation industry still being challenged with start-stops, and of course, paring down staff has made it challenging for us to reach out to some of these stakeholders and get information. So it's grinding away slow. We're very dependent on the information we're getting from similar facilities or facilities with similar amenities we've identified. So we're kind of at their whim, and we are getting information back. It's just not happening as fast as we'd like. At this point, the best estimate we have is mid to late summer before we'll have something to council. Again, that is very cautious based on any one of our COVID crystal balls. If things stay open, if there's less restrictions on recreation facilities and the staff, we expect to have that information by summer. And again, the information we are collecting is relative to specific business planning and amenity costs that we've identified in our feasibility study. It's kind of the update as we have it today.
Thank you for the update. And hopefully those that are curious were listening, and it allows us then to forward that information on to them. And I know any that's asked me, I've asked them to please just contact yourself. So we're all on the same page now. I note here that you're asking that perhaps this should be renamed, and I guess I look at this as being facility driven again. And maybe it needs to be ag rec facility.
Yeah, we have utilized this fund in the past to shore up some of the assets we have around Caroline Hub. That's not specifically ag, but I do know we need to differentiate between the legislated reserve that you guys discussed this morning. So rural recreation might be that driver, so that we don't say, well, this isn't a rodeo, we can't do something at Southeast Rec Grounds. You know, this may be the surplus area that council wishes to utilize for Southeast Rec Grounds development. And, you know, there will be some discussions in the future around the Southeast Rec Grounds, especially now that Eric's sort of acquired all the land around the hub. And that gives us a lot of flexibility now to plan, and this is the time to plan. So I think we're heading down a path where we will talk more about Southeast Rec Ground very soon. Of course, our partners at the Caroline Ag Society kind of lead us down that path, and we don't want to get ahead of them. And so I do know that in their budget they identified an area where they will do some work on the Southeast Rec Grounds, which will then obviously spur me on to steward it on to you folks when that time's appropriate.
Other thoughts or comments? Seeing none at this time. And again, I can see the value in the name change.
Council started to restrict funds for the purpose of what has been called a regional sewer facility in 2011. There have been more allocations and funds used for the sewer projects that have been completed since then. This account is projected to be just over 7.9 million at the end of 2020. There is also a Leslieville sewer account that has been accumulating with fees that are above the cost of operating that system in Leslieville. So at the end of 2020, this account is projected to be just over 153,000. The reason we kept them separate is because those dollars do come from that community, and we want to reuse them in that community.
Councillor Swanson.
Kirk, can you remind us, council, again, the date of our agreement with the Town of Rocky Mountain House and their sewer lagoon, please?
For sure. So the agreement that we have with the Town of Rocky Mountain House and the use of the lagoon expires, I believe it's October 14th, 2023. And on that note, as a reminder to council, that 2 years prior to that date, the Clearwater County will need to have a discussion with the town as to what their intent, our intent is moving forward. Do we want to remain as part of that facility and the use of that facility? So just to give council a heads up that to proceed into negotiations and what that may entail. Again, that'll be at this council's discretion on how we want to move forward. As again, as mentioned earlier, to carry on status quo. And by that, I mean, is that another 10-year agreement? Or modify the current agreement, or pull out completely, keeping in mind that, not that this, well, I imagine this may play a part in it, is that if you recall in September of 2020, we met and brought to your attention the Leslieville wastewater facility there, regional facility there. And currently, as per council's direction, we have in a 10-year plan that be constructed in 2022.
Supplemental?
So understanding that the town of Rocky Mountain House had some provincial and federal funds granted to them for their particular lagoon, will that play any effect in consultation with us going forward in regards to that contract, that agreement?
I would say so, depending what direction council would like to move forward. Currently, in my understanding, recollection, they're going to be about 7 million short in regards to funding that upgrades to that facility, and their intent, again, if I remember correctly, is to have that done in the next 5 years. So most definitely, that would be something that council would need to consider moving forward.
Well, there's certainly value in access to that facility, so those discussions are going to be important. Councillor Lang, then I'm going to Deputy Reeve Vandermeer. Oh, or not.
So if this agreement expires in 2023 and 2 years prior, we have to let the town know our intent, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So that's 2021, so.
That's upcoming here, and
We
yeah,
need to start these discussions
that is correct.
pretty much ASAP?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any, Councillor Duncan?
Just a clarification, the $3 million coming out of this fund in,
2022?
2022, that's Leslieville then?
Yes, that's correct.
I might remind you that we are still non-compliant in Leslieville.
An excellent point, Laird. As a reminder, we do have it in the 10-year capital as well, should council move forward with not proceeding with the regional wastewater system there at Leslieville. So we do have it in 10-year capital, just a little over 2 million, I believe it's 2.5 million, to account for the fact, as pointed out by Reeve Laird, that the current lagoon is being grandfathered, with the caveat and understanding that at any time Alberta Environment Parks can mandate that that be upgraded. So we keep that in the picture just in case.
Thank you for that clarification and reminder. Mr. Hagan, okay. Other questions or comments with regard to municipal sewer? Is that what we're renaming it?
Oh, yes. It's just labeled sewer.
Okay.
It's fine, either way for me.
I think that's that one.
Okay, next one is bridge infrastructure. Clearwater County has 173 bridge structures, which previously belonged to the province, and the declining condition and subsequent replacement fell on their plates. Recently, the province has wavered on funding bridge structures that Clearwater County thought were a priority, and subsequently stopped funding most structures at all. Recently, the province has put more dollars into the municipal bridge structures, and every dollar has been appreciated. At the end of 2020, the bridge deficit account is predicted to be, and again, this is the surplus account, not the amount of the deficit, at 12.4 million. Subsequent projects funded through this account are listed below in 2021, 2022, and 2023, leaving this fund at 3.6 million after the projects in the next 3 years.
Any questions or comments with regard to bridge infrastructure? Councillor Duncan?
The province currently, are they funding at 75% or 90% dollars on this one? The ones that we've gotten approved?
75%, Councillor Duncan.
And they haven't approved all of them, but we have seen some approvals in the last couple of years, so it's been good.
So this one, are we looking on the line that says bridge deficit?
Yes, bridge deficit.
So it's going to be renamed?
Infrastructure, yeah.
Councillor Lang?
Kurt, I'm just kind of wondering here, like, it was quite a few years that the province stopped funding the bridge program. Like, I know when I got in 2013, they weren't funding. And so did they start funding again, was it last year? And I guess what's the outlook? Do you think they're gonna maybe take away the funding? I'm asking for your crystal ball.
Sure. So you're absolutely correct. When you and I both started in the same year, there was a number of years. They didn't remove it in and of itself. That line item was still in the books, in the province's books. They just chose not to for the 4 years since when I first started to just put any monies associated to that line item. And then in the last 3, now upcoming 4th year, they did start funding again through what they call the Strategic Transportation Infrastructure Program, so STIP funding. And we've been blessed in the sense that over the last 3 years, we've had, I believe it's 7 out of the last 10 bridge structures funded through STIP. And as Rhonda pointed out, we've received quite a bit of funding in regards to that. They have not eliminated all due, although they made mention of it in the most recent provincial budget that will be decreasing over time here. So having said that, whether we're going to be as blessed in the last 2 years, we had 5 out of 6 last year. The year before that, we had 2 out of 3 funded. So as to what we may see this year, difficult to say. Again, that's a crystal ball thing.
All right. Given that we have seen a trend to underfund any of the grants, and including the recent trend for MSI to be cut by 25% by the provincial government, I would say that the crystal ball on funding limitations from grants is inclined to have less and less grant funding and more tax funding through whatever processes the municipality has at its disposal. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Yes, thank you. When the province put the pause on and stopped funding, there was a time when a few of our bridges became very critical, and I can't remember exactly, maybe 1 or 2 that were even closed for a period of time. With this funding and the program you've outlined here for the next 3 years, for 2021, 22, and 23, are we getting caught up, as it were, so that if the province paused again, could we go a couple of years without putting any money into bridges?
I would highly recommend not proceeding in that direction. That's my recommendation. We do have inspections being done on each of our bridge structures, ranging anywhere from 6 months to 57 months. So every 6 months to 57 months. We have, even though they are inspected, they'll go in there and inspect it, and depending upon that inspection, as each of you are well aware of, there's a rating system applied to each of our bridges, right? It's when they hit 3 out of 9 or 2 out of 9, usually 2 out of 9, then there's a significant concern behind that. So we try to the best of our ability, mitigate so that it doesn't get to a 2 or potentially a 3. But as you pointed out, Deputy Vandermeer, we have encountered those situations. And you're absolutely correct. I believe it was about 3 years ago, the Beaver Flat Bridge just came up for inspection, and prior to that, it was sitting at about a 3, potentially even a 4 in regards to overall, and it was a 2, just like that. And it was a restricted bridge, and all of us know that, are we able to police each of these bridges when they are restricted? And sure enough, that one vehicle crossed it, and whether or not it contributed to it dropping to a 2, hard to say. And right then and there, we had to close it, and we had to dip into the funds to do an emergency replacement on that. So I would not recommend just putting a hold on it. Anything can happen, no matter how well or how in-depth we try to mitigate it and stay ahead of it. There are those uncertainties. And as I said, we have 173 bridge structures, and that they have the potential to have something catastrophic happen to them without our knowledge.
Supplemental?
Please. Yes, clearly, if you had some catastrophic event, or like you say, it could be just a little extra traffic on a sensitive bridge, and perhaps even one gross overload by one trucking firm could make a difference. So clearly, I understand that if you have one of these emergency repairs required, you're going to do that. But my question was more in line with, with the program outlined, and if we got to the end of that program as an example, looking at the ratings on the bridges you have, are any of them currently in the danger zone in the 2 and 3 category?
Right now, we're handling those that are in the 2 and 3, and they're currently in our 5-year plan. But that's not to say within that 5-year that we'll encounter others that'll hit the 2 to 3 as well. Now, something else I just want to bring to council's attention is the James River Bridge. That, just to plant that seed, if not this council, next term's council, of where you want to go with that. And that replacement there is 7 million to replace that bridge. So something to consider as well.
Questions or comments? My question is, we must have a total asset value of the bridge infrastructure. That's to keep Mr. Hagan on his toes. What is that? And I wonder, if we need to consider funding this bridge infrastructure, can we look at a percentage replacement strategy? Mr. Hanson?
Not to dip my spoon in Kurt's soup, but I'm going to. So one thing that we did discuss is probably prior to this council was kind of as a threshold was a minimum of 3, have a reserve set up to fund at least 3 bridges, basically in the event of a catastrophic failure or some that. Now, Kurt would be the best to actually determine what 3 bridges are worth. But that was a rule of thumb that we'd held before, that was that reserve should be able to fund 3 bridges 100% to make sure that we never got ourselves into a predicament that we could be unfunded. That was, I'm sure that was before this council, but it was a principle and a philosophy that we had, I remember, years ago.
Mr. Hagan?
Thank you, Reeve. I'm sorry, I don't have a number for bridges specifically. Bridges are combined with roadways on our financial statements, but at December 31st, 2019, the total cost of roadways and bridges was $632,218,365. And the accumulated amortization on that was $392,191,001. And that resulted in a net book value, so you take the accumulated depreciation away from the cost. Net book value for roadways and bridges was $240,027,364.
Thank you. We recognize that the roads and bridges we drive on have a great deal of value, not just in their net book value, but the service it provides. And that's the quality, feeds into the quality of life our community members have come to know and depend upon. Every weekday, a school bus travels on those roads. At some point, some emergency services vehicle goes on those roads. Folks from all of our communities travel those roads. So we know how important they are. Councillor Lougheed.
I guess I have a question. It's based on the STIP funding. Is that project-based, or is it based more on an overall observation of the inventory of bridges? I just get some specifics on that.
Sure. Project-based. We don't exactly know. One thing, again, I'll emphasize project-based. And what we found in discussion with other municipalities is some municipalities, they get absolutely nothing. They've had nothing in terms of funding for any of their bridges. And again, as I said earlier, we've been blessed. We've had 7 of the last 9 structures that we had funded for. Whether that comes down to wordsmithing and how we describe our projects, we have a talented team back there that puts these applications together. And I couldn't tell you, Councillor Lougheed, how they go about making that decision, that where one municipality gets absolutely nothing and others, like ourselves, 5 out of 6 or 2 out of 3 get funded.
Any other questions or comments? I'll look to Ms. Sherhan. Were we able to give you a little bit more direction on how to proceed with this particular surplus, restricted surplus fund?
I think, we'll be back with the policy anyway, and we'll have general words in there, and I'm sure you guys will let me know where I should take it from there.
Okay, thank you.
So the next one is reserves held for regional waste. I believe it was 2 years ago, we consolidated regional waste numbers with Clearwater counties. We felt that those were needed to be transparent to our stakeholders on our financial statements. That being said, now with the addition of Clearwater Waste Services and the dissolution imminent for regional waste services, reserves will need to be calculated and divided among its partners. Or, in other words, the cash will be divided and the reserves will be no longer. We will have a clearer picture of these at next year end, but I think Mr. Hagan will provide a little more insight into them.
Yes, this is not a simple flick of the wrist process. This is quite complex. So if you can provide some insight, that would be most beneficial, Mr. Hagan.
Certainly, thank you, Reeve. So Mrs. Sirhan has covered it quite well in terms of these reserves were set up under the former Regional Waste Authority and designated by the board. So just taking it back to the beginning of this presentation, that board made decisions regarding the surpluses and the accumulated surplus and how much of that to restrict, and it was restricted into these 3 categories. The numbers you're seeing here are not the total of those categories. you would see the total on the regional waste financial statements. And 2020 will be the last year that we will be preparing those financial statements. What these numbers represent are Clearwater County's share of those reserves. And that is an accounting requirement under public sector accounting standards. Because essentially the Regional Waste Authority was a joint venture between the three municipalities, it was jointly controlled by the committee or the board. We need to do what is called proportionate consolidation. So we need to bring in our share of the assets, liabilities, equities, revenues, expenses, this being a subset of the equity. And we pull in our share. So as Ms. Serhan has indicated, our financial statements more clearly and transparently reflect everything that the county is responsible for. So I would suggest these numbers aren't going to change a whole lot for the year end 2020, with the exception of any transfers in or out of those reserves that occur within those regional waste financial statements. We will again be consolidating, but then those financial statements will be the key focal point for the distribution of those net assets or that equity overall. The good news is that these restricted surpluses are fully funded. They are available in cash and investments. And as Ron has indicated, once we go through that exercise according to the net asset distribution agreement, which council will be seeing at the special meeting tomorrow, then once all of the assets have been liquidated, all the liabilities have been satisfied with the exception of the closure, post-closure liability, and all the shares of those net assets have been divvied up, these reserves will effectively disappear, and administration will be coming back to council in the future with recommendations as to what we believe would be necessary or prudent to provide for waste management under the county's new model. So then they would be fully Clearwater County reserves like the rest of the reserves that you see on this list. So Reeve Laird is correct, it is a somewhat complex transaction and accounting, but we're working through it in partnership with the town and the village.
Thank you for that clarification. So we definitely will be seeing a transition over the coming months, and hopefully we'll see that cleaned up version after that.
Yes.
Other questions or comments with regard to regional and I'll say Clearwater waste? It's kind of a in transition moment. Seeing none?
Okay, that leaves, there's 3 accounts that I haven't touched on. One of them being the SAR equipment fund. There was 2 years where there was a $50,000 allocation for, and then the annual allocation stopped, and that account is sitting at $100,000. So there probably should be a decision made as to, are we going to continue to fund that? Is that a fund you just want to carry for now, or?
What does SAR use it for? Like, what is it
It's
for?
never been utilized. I believe it was about 5 or 6 years ago that it, there was an addition of 50,000 in thinking that SAR would be replacing some of its equipment and Clearwater County would contribute to that. But I'm not sure that that was ever actually, if there was a plan behind that at that time.
Ms. Hager?
Absolutely, thank you, Reeve Laird. I don't know the history behind how the reserve itself came to be, but we've been moving forward with search and rescue in an operational grant perspective, so that's funded through municipal taxes on an annual basis, and I don't have the number right in front of me, but I believe it was $50,000 for 2021. So they're funding their capital through that operational grant, which is the county provides. So it's capital for search and rescue, but it's, for us, it's operational. So I don't think the reserve needs to exist, but certainly perhaps we could utilize it, draw it down in 2021 from our operational perspective. Is that possible?
Yes, we could, I mean, it could be reallocated or we could use it to fund the SAR grant for 2 years.
To me, that seems appropriate.
Okay.
Other thoughts? Is that appropriate, Councillor Duncan?
There may be something in the MOU as well that would give us some more clarity on where the funds could go as well, like, you know, what the roles and responsibilities are. I don't know if, you know, that's upcoming for us as well.
Okay. Ms. Hager?
Absolutely. The current MOU and the future agreement don't actually reflect capital specifically. We've detailed it as an operational grant, but certainly that could be discussed if council wishes.
Supplemental?
So if there are any capital costs from SARS that we contribute to, we just call it an operational cost for ourselves, and then they're gonna continue to operate more or less at arm's length and even through the MOU and make the decisions on equipment basically themselves, and then talk to us about co-sharing some of those costs.
Ms. Hager?
Thank you again. Absolutely, Search and Rescue operates as its own entity, and they have all of their assets, including their building, tool sheds, et cetera, as well as their equipment, apparatus, vehicles, side-by-sides, et cetera, all in their name. And we do, through Clearwater County, provide insurance for all of their assets as an additional named insured, and specifically for those assets that I just listed. On top of that, we also provide that operational grant as well, and then they do quite a bit of fundraising for their capital assets as well. So I think through a combination of utilizing our operational grant and fundraising, they've been able to fund those capital assets. But I can't speak for Search and Rescue if they've got a plan in place for future, but we can make that part of our discussion as we bring forward that agreement.
Councillor Lang?
Well, I'm just trying to remember, so Search and Rescue is a separate entity, and I'm just wondering, did we start the operational grants as a result of provincial downloading? Like, they have always fallen under the umbrella of the RCMP, and I remember the first boat they got like 20 years ago. That was through the RCMP. And so is that how we became more involved in provincial downloading?
Again, the history is a little bit before my time in terms of work with Search and Rescue, but historically the county has provided an operational grant for several years. I want to say going back to 2015. I'm not sure, maybe Rhonda can remember further back than 2015. It has increased year over year in terms of the operational grant we've provided. And again, we added $5,000 in 2021 because of an ask for additional specialized training that Search and Rescue had. So it's certainly something that year over year has increased. As well, we've tried to consolidate all the ways in which we already provide supports for Search and Rescue. Like I said, the additional named insured for a liability perspective for their facilities and their people. So their volunteers are insured similar to Clearwater County employees in terms of liability, as well as their assets. And I mean, even the list of assets has grown over the years that we insure in terms of vehicles and apparatus. And again, I'm not 100% sure how the reserve came to be or what the intent was for that, but I would see this as something that could be expended utilizing some of the grant funding we're already providing, and then maybe dissolving that reserve. And you know, if there's a future conversation about larger scale capital, then we could have that conversation again, whether or not we needed a reserve to assist Search and Rescue, or whether that would be, like you said, a cost of the province. Search and Rescue, I believe, is housed under Municipal Affairs, but there's been some transition because they used to be Office of the Fire Commissioner as well. So there's been a little bit of shifting around. So I think we'll know more in probably the next year or so in terms of where they fit. But certainly they are generally tasked by the RCMP. So the cost of Search and Rescue response should be coming from the RCMP. There are times where we do task them as a tasking agency, and then we provide the funding that covers the mileage, any kind of out-of-pocket expenses for their volunteers if they're assisting our regional fire service provision. So that would be a separate kind of agreement in terms of how that works. But But you're right, they are at the responsibility of the province and the RCMP.
Other questions or comments with regard to search and rescue? Ms. Serhan?
So the other two, one of them's the rental income facility reserve, and we've moved those allocations to the facility reserve. So that one will be removed. And the last one is GIS. So historically, $76,000 has gone into a surplus account just to kind of smooth over that flyover cost. So I don't know if there will be changes to that.
Mr. Hagan?
Thank you, Reeve. Yes, council approved budget for 2021 to update the aerial photographs within their assessment system in GIS. And we're currently exploring different alternatives for that, and we'll likely be putting out an RFP to accomplish that this year.
Questions or comments? All right, seeing none.
So the final slide is unrestricted. So unrestricted surplus are surpluses that have not been identified for a specific project or purpose. These can be used for contingency or unexpected operating costs or subsequently moved to a restricted surplus account. Once financial statements are completed, council will have a solid number for additional surpluses in 2020. However, it appears there will be $4.5 million that can stay in unrestricted surplus or be moved to a restricted surplus account.
Questions or comments? Oh, Mr. Hagan?
Thank you, Reeve. Rhonda, can you just clarify, the $4.5 million, is that encompass what would have been in the 2020 budget for transfers to reserve? Is it over and above that, or is that part of it?
No, there was a balance left in 2019 of 1.7, and then an additional 2.6 going in there for 2021 after all the transfers and everything have been completed.
Okay, thank you.
And that's removing the transfer from the tax rate stabilization fund. It was not necessary to fund a deficit.
So is there opportunity here to put a cap or a maximum on this unrestricted surplus account? Perhaps that's a discussion we should be thinking about as well. Councillor Duncan.
That was my thought as well. This was one that probably should have a cap. I'm not quite sure I understand where the funds come into this from. Is it almost always just surplus from?
Yes, always surplus.
And then we reallocate.
Yeah, and then you reallocate from there. So if the surplus was higher than expected, then sometimes it would just sit in this account until the following year. Or if a decision wasn't made at the council meeting, sometimes the decision is just, we'll decide in the following year.
Because we've only really ever used this during the year as maybe, once the allocations are made, if there's still funds remaining, we would use it more like a contingency fund, right?
Yes, it's never been drawn upon during the year to fund contingencies or that sort. There's always a contingency budgeted year to year. This, because it's unrestricted, and even though the other ones are restricted, you could reallocate, but being that there's no identified project associated with this, there would be less of a decision to move this one from a different project to a new project. So if there's something came up during the year, this could be reallocated.
Okay, so you actually show, it going into negative ground by 2024. I'm not sure. That's just the way the math is working on this one, or?
Yeah, so sometimes if we don't balance all of the years ahead sometimes, so then it just shows the money coming from
I see.
unrestricted, yeah.
just to balance the reserves, or what we're committed to putting into other reserves.
Right, so in 2024, there needs to be some more discussion about what's going into reserve, what projects we're doing, how we're going to fund them. So typically during budget, we balance the year, 1 year or sometimes two ahead, and just have the other projects and numbers there for information and discussion, just so we can have a bigger picture discussion, and we don't, we aren't legislated to balance those years.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I think we could have a fairly low cap on this one, just, or maybe it doesn't require a cap, just maybe the policy is that, as much as possible, this reserves are allocated to the restricted surpluses over the course of the year. I'd hate to see us, if we put a cap on it, then we have to do something with it, or not, I guess, but, or if, yeah, either way would work, I think, but I think it is one we shouldn't let grow too large, or else it's kind of gets in the gun sights of the province we shouldn't have those unrestricted reserves.
Well, and that was some of my thinking, and I think it does warrant some further discussion about, policy or a cap or some sort of process that says by a certain time or date or whatever that we will reallocate funds. There might be something to that effect. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Thank you. Yes, following up on Councillor Duncan's comments, I think that 4.5 million is on the high side here. It's I don't know that we need a specific cap, but I would suggest that we could reduce this in between the $1 and $2 million range. About $1.5 million would seem a reasonable amount. So I believe there's about $3 million that should be reallocated into a restricted category.
So what is the wishes of this council? To leave, I'll call it kind of a cap at the moment, but of leaving 1.2 or 1.5 to 2, what's your thoughts? Councillor Duncan, I'm going to start with you, just your idea of kind of what you think is an appropriate number. I am concerned about leaving a lot in that account.
Well, we have a process here where all our surplus goes into this, and then we go through that process and reallocate. So I think the policy would just be to indicate that each year unrestricted surplus is reallocated to restricted surplus, and then I would cap it as well at 1.5 is probably a number to start at.
So 1.5?
Make sure just to trigger that we look at it every year and realize we need to get down to 1.5 as a maximum left in the account.
Councillor Lougheed.
I know earlier on we had a discussion around a percentage of the operating budget. There might be some usefulness in keeping that unrestricted amount at a percentage. It would allow some flexibility there still that's related to an expected expenditure or an expenditure that could be unforeseen. But definitely, I think a cap is a valuable thing to have here. So these monies are put into the restricted surplus categories.
Do you have a number in mind?
I think the 1.5 million, that would relate back to about 5% of that operating amount. So that would seem like a reasonable contingency.
Thank you. And at least it relates it to something. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Yes, I agree with the 1.5 as a cap this time.
Councillor Lang.
I'm okay with 1.5 as the max. I was even leaning towards 1 million.
Councillor Hoven.
I'm okay with the 1.5.
Councillor Swanson.
Actually, I like Councillor Lougheed's and mindset in regards to our percentage versus a number in a way, because I mean, our budget changes every year. So it might mean we need to keep more, and it might need, so if we say 5% needs to be in there, then we know what that number is when we do our budget deliberations. So 5% seems to be a very cool number. It's 1.6 when I do 32 million, but I mean, we're gonna have less at some point, but for today's discussion, yes, 1.5 would be fine, but I think we need to move towards a percentage versus a number. Because that's, when you're allocating for inflation and everything else that could happen, I mean, we need to be a part of that with our financials.
All right, so we've given you kind of an indicator of a dollar value. I'm gonna just look for the thumbs up on the 5%.
5% is how much, Ken?
5%, yes. That's a go. So where does that bring us to?
That's about 2.7 that needs to be,
So we need to reallocate 2.7? Mr. Hanson, here we go.
I want to be the first of the bunch. So I guess one elephant in the room, I guess, you know, through our regionalization studies there, something that can't be forgotten, I think should be considered right at the onset of thought and discussion of reallocation of funds is that if Clearwater County inherits a very large infrastructure deficit, you know, that could be, it could take all of our plans and really be disruptive. So I would certainly encourage councils to really consider core infrastructure as a high priority to try to lessen the blow in case we substantially inherit a huge infrastructure deficit that's unplanned at this time. Thank you.
That was a great advocacy right there, and we'll see how it resonates with our council to call it core infrastructure. Councillor Duncan.
I think some of those exist, so that would be like sewer and public works capital then would be the roads, so paving or, so would basically, sorry, like if we're redoing paved roads in Leslieville or Condor or something, are those coming out of paving or do we have separate accounts that we run those out of? And so I'm thinking of, you know, if it was Carolina Rocky we were doing, it would be something.
Mr. Hanson.
So there's a couple of opportunities at council's disposal. One being basically an offsite, not an offsite levy, but a local improvement tax. In my time here, since 2009, I've never known us to use a local improvement tax for a hamlet yet. We've always used either our MSI funding, our paving reserves, etc. But that is another tool in the toolbox there. If you have a local improvement there, that is an opportunity to enhance that core infrastructure in a hamlet or etc.
Supplemental?
So the other way on that too is different tax rates depending on where you live, right? And depending on the services provided. And I don't know if we're not doing that yet either, although we are charged, you know, we do charge over, at least in Leslieville, we've collected over and above the operating costs for water and sewer there.
Sewer only.
Sewer only, sorry, yes, no water provided there.
Meaning it's a utility fee.
Yes, there's, yeah. But you know, we will have to find ways to fund this. You know, if we're taking on debt from another municipality, that would be, we need to find ways to fund those.
Well, I agree. It's important to think about taking the bumps out of the road. I can appreciate why our road guy would come up with that as well.
Yeah, and then to be clear, I'm not just an advocate for roads, it's, our water, wastewater, roads. Thank goodness, not too many bridges in our urban centers, but, the bills that come with upgrading a water treatment plant and a sanitary system, chews up, makes a pretty big bump.
Yes.
We'll put it that way.
I wasn't meaning literal, I promise you. Councillor Hoven.
I agree with Mr. Hansen's recommendation.
Councillor Swanson, I'm gonna go that way.
I agree with
Core infrastructure.
core infrastructure.
Councillor Lang. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer.
Just to comment on, the inheriting core infrastructure problems, you're thinking of one smaller municipality we're contemplating here. And yes, there will be a bump in the road there, without doubt. But hamlets will have higher taxes ultimately than rural residents. It relates to the services you receive. Right now, that municipality has significantly higher taxes than Clearwater County. And that is, of course, part of the impending discussion as to how we will arrange the tax rates, because if there are any absorptions, the tax rate and the services, tax rate, services, and the representation are the key factors to be considered. I would definitely allocate some more funds into the broadband area. We note that there is a depletion of those reserves quite soon, so that's probably going to come up quicker than some of these other things.
There, that's another option to consider. Councillor Lougheed.
Definitely our core infrastructure tends to absorb the majority of the budget, so I think that would be a wise decision to place the money in the reserves that affect that core infrastructure.
Thank you. Councillor Duncan.
I'm okay with both core infrastructure and potentially some broadband as well.
And for me, I recognize that we still have a workshop coming for broadband. I think that would give me some confidence in better understanding that particular project. So for now, I'm comfortable with core infrastructure. I recognize that if we need to reallocate again, we know which pot I would be looking at first then. Would be, okay, can we relook at the core infrastructure that we're talking about and see if we need to scratch some of that back and change it around a little bit. So that being said, I just looking forward to the workshop coming up in mid-May, I believe. Ms. Sherhan.
I think that wraps it up.
That wraps it up. I do have one, I noted a couple things for myself. What is the anticipated time frame for completion of this policy that we're talking about?
Probably not for 8 weeks yet.
Okay. And then would we also, I know often we like to, at least in my mind, divide these up by department. Is there an opportunity at all to, I guess, put these by department at all?
Yeah, we should look at reorganizing.
Thank you. And I guess the last part is, as as we work through the communication strategy with our community members, I'd like to know if we have a way, RMA put together the apples to apples discussion paper with regard to how reserves are used and allocated. I'd like to see if we can use some of that to better describe to all who look at this, who see this as some, I'll call it big account of dollars, that we have a purpose, there's a process, there's policy. Perhaps there's an opportunity to marry those documents somehow, or at least reference them. Mr. Hagan?
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Reeve Laird, and we've already taken steps in that direction. We've included select restricted surplus accounts in our recent newsletters to the community and with some background and so forth. And we've also posted that information on our website, and I believe there's a link on this agenda to that information, so we're on the same page with that. I think it's incredibly important that people understand that there's a planned purpose for these funds. With that, I'd also point out and remind folks that the surplus that we're talking about is not a surprise. That is part of council's planning process when they create their budgets and approve them, in that a certain amount of surplus is anticipated every year in order to be able to fund these restricted reserve funds for future purposes and so forth. And what we're dealing with today is just a variance in that anticipated surplus. So again, that'll come up next week when we present the financial statements. And it is all part of the planning process.
Thank you for the clarification. Ms. Surhan, do you have anything additional?
No, that's everything. Thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you. To discuss this at length. The other outstanding issue in my mind, there is a lot of community members and discussion about concern that the province or others are going to swoop in and take these reserves away. If there is something that we can do to add confidence and reassurance, I think that that is a valued time and energy for communications as well. And if there's something that you could say even today to that comment, that might be helpful as well. Mr. Hagan?
Thank you, Reeve. I think Ms. Surhan covered it actually quite well in her opening comments, is that we don't have the freedom and flexibility that the larger governments do, the provincial and federal governments. Certainly, we can't go into deficit. So we need to plan for the future. And this municipality has been very fortunate in terms of industrial activity, where the majority of property tax revenue has come from historically. And I think this municipality has also been very diligent in allowing for those excess funds to be put away for future, recognizing that we have vast infrastructure over a large geographic area to maintain in order to support the industry going forward. And especially since we also recognize the current strain on provincial budgets. And it honestly wouldn't be realistic or fair for us to be going back to the provincial government with our hands out consistently. We need to plan ahead, and any assistance we get from the province is very much appreciated, but we can't count on that. We need to provide a path forward for ourselves. And so I would encourage the provincial government also to realize that if they were to direct us to either apply our restricted reserves against our operations and our capital projects in the near term, or alternatively refund those to the government, it's going to create a shortfall for us, and that's going to put pressure back on them. So it really is a partnership between the different levels of government. And quite honestly, we're doing our part to plan for the future and be as self-sufficient as we possibly can. And these restricted surpluses are a main mechanism for doing that.
And I appreciate that, and I guess if I were to put it in different terms, as municipalities mature and we come into our own, I would suggest that the provincial government is weaning us off of our allowance, or our anticipated allowance. That's how I see it. So we're expected to figure it out, is where I believe the province wants us to go. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, it is 12:18, looking for someone to motion to adjourn this meeting. Deputy Reeve Vandermeer, those in favor? That is carried.